And if that light still shine, how do you not see divinity in how we've tried, my niggas got?
I think you don't know who you are. I think that's why you falling short. On leg, on head, that's a lot. Maybe it sounds odd. Niggas, you a god.
All right, Dr. Edward Onaci, everybody. On behalf of City Lights, booksellers and publishers in San Francisco, and Wooden Shoe Books in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I would like to welcome you to the second installment of what is a four-part series about anti-fascist movements and street-level organizing. These events are curated by Hilary Moore and James Tracy and draw their origins from the recently released book, No Fascist USA, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and Lessons for Today's Movements. It is published by City Lights Books in San Francisco. Copies of the book are being sold today by Wooden Shoe Books. We'll be posting the link in the comment section of your screen, so please do purchase the book if you haven't already. Help out a really, really awesome bookstore. You'll also be helping out City Lights Publishing as well. Indies really need your help in COVID times. Each book really does make a difference, so thank you in advance for your support. As mentioned, there are two additional events in the series coming up. One's going to be on Sunday, August the 9th with Mark Bray. It's going to be featured by Powell's Bookstore in Portland. Also on Thursday, August the 27th with Susan Reverby, and that's going to be held by Carmichael's Bookstore in Louisville. SURJ is going to be co-sponsoring that. You may register for all of these at citylights.com. So before we begin, I'd like to welcome Matt Deneen with Wooden Shoe Books in Philadelphia, our co-sponsor for today's event, to say a few words and to get the program started. Welcome, Matt.
Hey there, thanks a lot, and hello everybody. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly introduce the Wooden Shoe and then introduce our three speakers today. So Wooden Shoe Books and Records is an all-volunteer anarchist collective. It was founded in Philadelphia back in 1976, and we're miraculously still going strong today. And we actually reopened the store recently. So for those of you in the Philadelphia area, we are open at 704 South Street. And if you check out that link that's included in the chat, there's also information about ordering online. And we do have both of the books, No Fascist USA and Free the Land, available. We're gonna do 20% off, which we like to do around events. So that's about the Wooden Shoe. And I also just wanted to say that we were planning on hosting this event initially in our space. I believe it was April 3rd, but then of course this whole book tour was canceled because of the global pandemic. And now here we are, and I'm really excited that we were able to make this happen today. We're coming from 3 different time zones all over the planet, and I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank City Lights a lot. So now on to our 3 speakers today, Hilary Moore, James Tracy, and Ed Onaci. Hilary Moore is an anti-racist political educator and teaches with generative somatics. She works on the leadership team of Showing Up for Racial Justice and is the author of No Fascist USA, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and Lessons for Today's Movements, and also Organizing Cools the Planet, Tools and Reflections to Navigate the Climate Crisis. Her newest book is Burning Earth, Changing Europe, How the Racist Right Exploits the Climate Crisis and What We Can Do About It. And Hilary's co-author, James Tracy, is an author, organizer, and an instructor of labor and community studies at City College of San Francisco. He is the co-author of Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels and Black Power, Community Organizing in Radical Times, and the author of Dispatches Against Displacement, Field Notes from San Francisco's Housing Wars. And our final guest is Dr. Edward Onaci, who is the author of Free the Land, The Republic of New Africa and the Pursuit of a Black Nation. So that just came out this year on University of North Carolina Press. He teaches courses on African American history, modern US history, women's global political struggles, social movements and music in Africa and its diaspora, and more at Ursinus College. They incorporate interdisciplinary scholarship and emphasize student empowerment. Dr. Onaci's instruction also makes use of creative resources and high impact tools, such as reacting to the past in digital liberal arts projects. His approach encourages students to take ownership over their personal and group studies, produce their own knowledge, and apply what they learn in class to their current lives and future ambitions. So now I'm gonna turn it over to our speakers. Everybody, welcome Hilary, James, and Ed.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to be here.
All right, take us away, Ed.
All right. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Really happy to have a chance to speak with the authors of this book. And I'll jump into a couple of questions. And I want to start with some of the basics. First, can you just tell us, what is the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee? And when you answer, can you tell us some of their major goals, some of the people who are involved, and some of the strategies and tactics that they use to promote their goals?
Totally. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, for sure. I think I want to start with the context and history. I feel like it's kind of like lessons for today's movements, but it's absolutely a history book, and some of the external conditions that really shaped the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. You know, the organization started in 1977, and so this was a very particular moment. The two things that we really lift up, although there's of course many things happening, is the rise of the third wave of the Ku Klux Klan and other Klan-like groups, whether that's neo-Nazi groups or other kinds of white power groups. And what they were doing at the time is organizing in public. They were rebranding themselves to be more digestible to middle class and also kind of more palpable for more mainstream society. And they're also enacting a strategy to associate themselves with a different kind of racist politic, which included an organizing strategy up south. So kind of breaking with the stereotype that the Klan is contained to the South, but kind of infiltrating, using, and expanding outside the South, and particularly in New England. And so at the same time, it was in the mid 70s, late 70s, that the height and the consequence of COINTELPRO, FBI, the FBI program, counterintelligence program that was surveilling key leaders in all kinds of movements, came down particularly hard with infiltration, harassment, inciting divisions, and murder. And so these two pieces were like some of the context for the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, the catalyst for them, which was state repression and racist vigilante violence. And so that was kind of the milieu that was happening. And I feel like other pieces that are quite important about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is that they did anti-racist politics, they did anti-fascist politics, but from an anti-imperialist standpoint. And that means that these were left radicals, already organized, already working and supporting movements for self-determination in the 60s and 70s. And then with the consequences of COINTELPRO, that work got redirected a lot into supporting political prisoners. And so they started in 1977 as Black activists in upstate New York, were kind of sounding the alarm around the Klan infiltrating and using their positions as employees of the prison system, and the fact that not a lot was happening. And so what they called for was support. And that's one of the pieces that catalyzed the organization. It was a chapter-based organization. It was a network. It began in 1977, kind of ended in 1992, although there's definitely threads and life to it still today. It was 12 cities in cities where there were already pretty active movements and organizations for self-determination. So they were quite paired with movements in that way. And that often meant larger metropolitan cities all over the country. And at the core, what they were concerned with was abolition. Abolitionists, they named themselves after John Brown. And they saw imperialism as an external strategy and an internal strategy. So imperialism, controlling and murdering Black and brown communities outside of our nation's borders and empire, and then inside, how the Klan and police play that kind of role with different tactics, different methods internally, and that terrorism at home. And if any nerd, which I appreciate, already has the book, you can turn to page 53 and look up Laura. Ed's like, yeah, I got it. 53, Laura Whitehorn's quote still sticks with me. I think about it often. She says, "Our main strategy was to bring white people in contact with the Black Revolution and allow them to be changed by it by the way that we had." And that looked a lot of different ways. And what I appreciate about John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is it, started off a bit more like going into neighborhoods, signing up, kind of antagonizing folks to get involved, and it went more into coalition politics and then building broad coalitions. And so there's a whole arc of change in the tactics that they used, but through and through this principle of like bringing more white folks into contact with the Black revolutionary tradition, knowing how powerful that is, knowing that almost in every moment of history, it has always catalyzed radical change for many communities. So that's kind of situating the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. But James, do you want to add?
Thank you.
Many things I left out?
No, I don't have much to add. I think one of the two important things about John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. One is that they were a project of just like Republic of New Africa, of extending values and politics that were learned in the 60s anti-racist struggles, various threads. So we have veterans of SNCC, of many different organizations, joining, but trying to continue these politics in a vastly different context. So the rate of 77, Reagan certainly wasn't going to be in power for another 3 years, but all the markings of a resurgent right were already there, and the new right was building. And so what might have been some revolutionary optimism of the 60s, thinking that by 1984 there'd be some form of democratic anti-racist socialism, quickly became, how do we retool towards a 1984 that's going to look a lot like 1984, the book. And I think that's important thing to understand and respect, of keeping people one's values and politics fairly consistent, but being able to shift as circumstances and contexts shift. And certainly every time we as a community mobilize against the far right in the streets, the echoes of the same debates around tactics come up. How much confrontation is necessary? Is it always necessary? Are there other ways to do it? How do you bring people with vastly different tactics together to fight a common enemy? Those things were there when John Brown Anti-Klan Committee and their allies were in business, and they're still with us today, accelerated and somewhat remixed by the presence of social media.
Great, thank you both.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Cool. Please talk to us about your book and your scholarship, and orient the folks on this call to the Republic of New Africa and the New African Independence Movement. Like, who are these folks? What did they care about? How did they go about doing their work? And also, I love your book, I gotta say.
Thank you. Likewise. Yeah, thanks for the question. The Republic of New Africa I like to talk about this in two ways. One, the Republic of New Africa are people who, because of the legacies of human trafficking, of war, kidnapping, human trafficking, and enslavement of African people, have become a captive nation in the United States of America. And the other way that I like to talk about the Republic of New Africa is the land mass that this captive nation claims as its own. And that landmass consists of the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia. And the New African Independence Movement is an ongoing effort that began in 1968 with a convention whereby 500 well-known nationalists came together and decided that they would pursue independence as a primary strategy for Black liberation. It is that effort to get self-determination through a UN monitored plebiscite, land, the 5 states, and they're actually right behind me, the 5 states on that book cover right there, to get political independence and to get reparations for the enslavement, for lynching and all types of racist terror, for Jim Crow segregation, and all of the, I would say, all of the shortcomings that came with being, and I'm using some of their language now, that came with being forced into US citizenship under the 14th Amendment, and an incomplete citizenship at that, when it should have been offered to a newly freed nation. And so that is the short version of the New African Independence Movement and the Republic of New Africa. Some of the things that I do with the book is I'm interested in, I'm a historian. I'm interested in historicizing social movements. I'm really interested in culture though, particularly how people live according to the ideals and values that they've based their politics on. And so a lot of what my book does is it tries to trace and understand the lived practice of being a new African Black nationalist revolutionary. And I look at that, I use a concept called lifestyle politics to capture some of the daily lived experiences, the mundane choices that people made that they thought would help facilitate and advance this New African Independence Movement. And
That's
so, yes, please.
Real quick, just to like shout out, that was one of the things I really appreciated about your book, is like the intimacy and the care that you took to, I felt like, really bring out the humanness of people who've been talked about by the state in such a different kind of way. And in reading the stories and the visions, the cares, the concern, the commitments that you highlight in the book, it's just a massive contribution into understanding like why folks do what they do, and then also how compelling that is when we actually know that. So
yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I try to be as best as possible a highly engaged student of social movements. And one of the things that I noticed with the scholarship on social movements was, with the exception of probably SNCC and a few of the well-known civil rights organizations and some of the women's rights organizations, there tends to be a lack of that human connection, that very real human impact in the scholarship. And so we get the organizations, we get the strategies, the tactics, here's where they messed up, let's really talk about that. And, you know, sometimes for really good reasons, without giving us a good idea of, well, what happened to the people who were involved? And so I'm glad that I was able to have that approach and bring that to life for you and then anybody else who values that. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And likewise, of course, I've already said it, get this book. You are also, you tell these stories from people's perspectives themselves, which I really appreciate. It gets us away from that one leader and that one event, which for too long, I think, has characterized the scholarship. One of the other things that I really appreciated about the book is how you open up each chapter. And I want to go to chapter 3 And I'll read a poem from Jane Cortez. I'm not a poet, so please forgive me if I don't have the rhythm and the cadence and all that good stuff. But the ruling class will tell you that there is no ruling class, as they organize their liberal supporters into white supremacist lynch mobs, organize the children into Ku Klux Klan gangs, organize their police into killer cops, organize their propaganda into a device to ossify us with angel dust. And that's Jane Cortez. There it is. And I'm curious to know, for you, James and Hilary, what does that poem mean to you, and why include that poem in this book, particularly in the chapter that's titled "After Winter Must Come Spring: The Anti-Klan Movement"?
Mm-hmm. Well, James, do you want to go? You're our resident poet.
Well,
I gotta think.
former poet, but Jane Cortez. This piece was written, at the same time that all of the events in both your book and our book were going down. I had the honor of seeing Jane Cortez read this poem in New York long after with Linton Kwesi Johnson, and what captures to me is that it's poetry and it's also journalism. Right? It talks about what's going on in such a beautiful way that we can read it, apply it to today, but also get a glimpse of what was going on back then. I think Jane Cortez, in a better world, would be the Minister of Culture in a post-revolutionary world or nation of some sort. Yeah, I think it really captures the politics, the concern, the urgency that drove both the Republic of New Africa and the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee. And I know that Jane Cortez was, if you do a little internet research, was often doing benefits for these groups, cultural performances for Black nationalist groups, Black liberation groups, and just about everybody. So she was definitely one of the engaged, really engaged artists of that time.
Definitely. I appreciate James so much. I want to be in all your classes, James. The thing that strikes me and that it made sense for that chapter and for, of course, that time is like everything that James said, but also the way that, she paints a picture in terms of the different kinds of state violence at the time and vigilante violence and the weaving of that. And what I feel like is important in this book, John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, is the fact that, they didn't see the Klan as like a lunatic fringe, but an aspect of a racist movement that also reflected an enormous part of white racist sentiment in the US. And so by doing that weaving, and also it just points to, I think, like one of the later lines, page 133, if anybody has it in front of you, the poem that Ed just read, but killer cops is one of the lines in that poem. And that's also one of the campaigns that the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was trying to amplify and mobilize in more white communities. And by no means was that a novel phrase, but what they did was try to organize, mobilize around that. And, in particular, they saw the Klan kind of at different moments in history, and they took a very long view of history, that the Klan and Klan-like groups were in collaboration with the police or federal authorities, like sharing information. Greensboro, 1997 is a very prime example for that. Or Klan and the Klan-like groups was in alignment with the police or federal authorities with a shared aim, right, to control and to repress Black and brown communities. And 1964, with the murder of the 3 civil rights activists, with the police delivering these activists to the Klan to be murdered, is one example of that. Or they saw that the Klan and the police had a relationship of involvement, like shared membership. Like the inception of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee was sparked by an inmate, a prisoner, a Black activist in upstate New York, who's saying that the Klan has a particular role in the prison, the Klan has a particular role in the policing system. So there's a shared membership or infiltration where these groups find political alignment, find a home, and can, more or less nest up in some of these state institutions. So, they also had campaigns called Blue by Day and White by Night, and cops and the Klan go hand in hand. And yeah, so I feel like the poem is a very, it paints a kind of picture that was really representative of the John Brown Anti-Klans Committee of Politics, but absolutely, most importantly, the organizations that they were trying to support, which at its core was like their commitment was to support Black and Brown liberation movements. And then part of that was then, like the logic was then that Klan and Klan-like groups were a major threat to those organizations in that time, like James talked about with the entrenchment of the new right and then beginning of the Reagan Revolution. So yes, doing confrontation work, anti-fascist work, but it's within this anti-imperialist, anti-racist strategy.
Yeah, if I may, I appreciate that because it really makes clear something that you all point out in the book, which is, yes, there is an actual Ku Klux Klan and it's all over the country, but it's better to think of the Klan as a metaphor for how white supremacy is just infused throughout society and at the very foundations of the system. So yeah, I love the choice of this poem. It just definitely makes me want to get back into poetry. So good choice, James. And thank you, Hilary, for allowing that to go in there at that place. Really good choice.
Definitely. Cool. Do you mind if we just keep going back and forth? Can I ask you again about?
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah. Cool. So help continue to fill out this picture of the Republic of New Africa and the African independence movement, however you want to talk about it. But what were the guiding principles of, this body of work? And then how did that move through the decades? Of course, before this time period, during, and then also after. How do we see them now?
Yeah, so I have just two words: self-determination. That's really the beginning and end, and everything that's in between that, very important, but they begin with the concept of independence, political independence and territorial sovereignty, and they end with political independence and territorial sovereignty. And so, but some of the other principles that prop that up, I mentioned, I believe, reparations. And so from the beginning, the people who came together to form what they called the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, they claimed in their statement declaring that they're going to pursue independence, they said, we also are trying to get the reparations that are due to us because of, these centuries of oppression and the continued disenfranchisement, police brutality, dilapidated housing, et cetera, that isn't a condition that Black people created, but is a condition that capitalism and white supremacy and imperialism created in order to continue to extract wealth from what is now, by the 60s becoming seen as a superfluous population within this broader capitalist structure. And so they talked quite a bit about reparations. By the early 1970s, they being the provisional government, because there are a number of groups that are part of the New African Independence Movement, and I'll mention them in just a moment, but the provisional government released what they called the anti-depression program. And really, it's a framework for bringing the provisional government of the RNA to the table with the diplomats from the United States government to discuss the terms for reparations. And the way that they frame it, which I think is really brilliant, is they frame it as a way to basically tell the United States government, look, just give us what you owe, we'll take it from there. We don't need your help. We don't want welfare, which we know by the early 70s is not intended to help anybody anyway. give us the money. We've already started working on the land, and we'll build the independent nation that we have been calling for. So that's the anti-depression program. It did make its way. It's something that they continued to push and into the 80s, and it eventually made its way into the establishment of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, or NCOBRA. If you study the anti-depression program and you study NCOBRA's platform, you'll see a lot of the same language, and that's not an accident. Anybody who's familiar with NCOBRA knows that people like Mario Bedelli, who co-founded and became president of the PGRNA for quite some time, he co-founded NCOBRA and has been hailed by many people in the reparations movement as the father of the modern reparations movement. But people like Chokwe Lumumba, people like Nkechi Taifa, and a whole host of people whose names we don't necessarily hear because they don't have the profile that those three have, but who had been involved in the New African Independence movement either from the beginning or very early on. So that's a principle, and that's some of how it evolved over time. The other thing that I'll say, just so I don't talk forever, because believe me, I can, is they talked quite a bit about political prisoners and prisoners of war. And that is something that when they came together that final weekend in March of 1968, from the very beginning, they had whole discussions based on political prisoners and prisoners of war. Everything from calling for the release of political prisoners and, you know, trying to utilize, I should say, a lot of the people who founded this movement were lawyers. And so they were very interested in international law and had a very good grasp of it. And so they oftentimes try to use that language of international law to advocate for people who were in the prison system because of their political activities. And one of the ways that evolved was, first of all, they continued to just advocate for their basic goals, land, independence, reparations. And in doing so, they experienced two shootouts. One was a raid, one was just a really bad situation for everybody involved. And that was New Bethel, what we call the New Bethel incident in 1969. But there were people who were actively engaged in armed struggle as well, either because they associated with the Black Liberation Army or because in their local areas, they had either some instruction from somebody, and I can't say, and nobody will say, right? They may have had some sort of instruction, or they may have taken it upon themselves to participate in what they saw was a war against capitalism and against white supremacy. And the soldiers of white supremacy in Black neighborhoods are the police. And so there were a lot of, we don't hear about that very often, but if you look through the FBI documents and if you talk to some people who their information is already out there, they are pretty clear that, you know, we were going to war and so were they. And it was mutually understood that that's what was happening. And because of that, people just, you know, people would go to prison on a pretty regular basis. So they started to organize within prison, and they also started to organize prisoner support outside of prison. In 1973, Chokwe Lumumba worked with the African Liberation Support Committee, with the African People's Party, Congress of African People, and, you know, the whole list of all the organizations that would be involved on International African Prisoner of War Solidarity Day. And the way that I understand it is from that, there's a direct connection to people like Safia Bukhari and the Jericho movement. There's a direct connection to you two will have to correct me because I'm about to butcher this name, but the COINTEL Litigation Task Force, and I know I just messed it up, but there are these direct connections that I see from that moment. And we can fast forward. you know, it's Black August. I had to wear my Black August shirt, free them all. Within the prisons, people were organizing for independence and for revolutionary warfare. So there are groups like the Black Guerrilla Family, there's New African Prisoners Association. They were developing themselves physically and mentally. And that's what I really want to emphasize here before I yield the floor. A lot of theory about the prison system and about political prisoners and prisoners of war come from people in these groups. And I because I have it right here, people like George Jackson, even though I don't think he was associated directly with the New African Independence Movement, he was involved with people who were thinking about, okay, how can we develop ideas and theory and action based on being here in the belly of the beast to help advance this movement for this revolutionary movement that, again, destroys capitalism, white supremacist imperialism, and creates the space for oppressed nations to exercise self-determination. And so a lot of what we're doing, those of us who commemorate Black August, that's one of the enduring legacies as well of not of the New African Independence Movement, but also more broadly, people who were participating in Black power and Black liberation struggles, even if they weren't directly associated with the New African Independence Movement. And so, oh, I'm sorry, were you about to say something?
No, go for it.
Okay, okay. Just thinking about, I was about to say something about coalition. And both of you, I believe, earlier talked about how the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee developed into a coalition building organization. And I don't know if that's too strong of a statement, but they did reluctantly embrace coalitions. And despite them believing that placing an intense emphasis on solidarity, I'm sorry, I feel like I butchered that just a little bit. They believed in intense solidarity almost from the beginning, or from the very beginning, if I read this correctly, but they were still slow to develop the coalition building politics. And so I'm just curious to know, why were they slow? I mean, if they believe in solidarity, why not just from the beginning start building coalitions? And when they did end up moving toward the coalition building phase, who did they work with, and what were some of the outcomes of their alliances and coalition work?
Cool, yeah. I mean, this is one of the questions for me that made the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee an organization within a particular political moment worthy of study, like interesting to study, worth studying. And I think because some of the contradictions or the tensions in this question, or at least how I interpret it in reading and studying and writing about them, are still prevalent today, especially for white anti-racist organizing. Like, you know, I work with Surge and we do community-based building organizing, and these questions are still absolutely alive. And so I feel like there aren't period kinds of answers like done, but some of the tensions that they are in are very useful today. And I think to answer your question, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, in my impression, was at first quite skeptical of working with other anti-racist white people. And it's paradoxical, like there's tensions here. On one side, or within this question, there's like, they knew that they needed masses of white people to sign on to this thing called anti-racism, like in a very dedicated, rigorous way. And at the same time, if you look at kind of any moment in history, and we name a few, I think especially in chapter 1, of like, why did the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee take this position, is that there wasn't a good track record of white people who are willing to support abolition and revolutionary traditions. You know, it's a lot of like the back and forth. There's a lot of examples of like, we get where you're going, but we don't like how you're doing it. Or we like generally agree with the principles, this should be different, but you know, this is too soon or too quick. There's all these excuses of like why it wasn't possible now. And what I appreciated about the John Brown anti-Klan community is they really took it seriously, in that they were willing to organize them. Yep, I did it. Willing to organize themselves around supporting movements for self-determination. And then they were in this negotiation of like, okay, well, how do we get more white people in on this? And one of the things I appreciate about them is like that principle stayed true the whole time, but then they shape shifted in their 12, 13 years, trying to like find the right formation. What does it look like in different cities, different contexts, you know, answering this question of how do we do this well? And I think the other piece before I pass it to James is like, also their theory of change, at least in terms of practice, also shifted. And there was an influx of like, you know, May 19th and Prairie Fire and all these like background context pieces. But, you know, in the beginning, starting in the East Coast, it was really a lot of like interpretations of what moves people is exemplary action by a few. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if the moment is right, you know, if you are or are not in a revolutionary state of being, as in like the country that you're in or the moment that you're in, you know, if a few people who are bold enough, rigorous enough, take a kind of action, that might catalyze more people into action. And so that was kind of what shaped their understanding in the beginning. And then over time, also Reagan, all these different pieces started to shift and change, which I think are really important about the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, right? They stayed flexible, is like they started to move towards community mobilizing and trying to build more of a network and more accessibility. And I think how they did that, the questions, the challenges, the limitations, honestly, a big push within this context of why they changed was because the New African Independence movement and folks in that milieu were like, y'all need to do better. Y'all need to like work with more folks. You need to do this. You know, that's what chapter 3 was actually about. That's what it starts with, is like, folks were like, we need you to do this, this, and this. How are you going to do it? So those like that political tuning, the compass tuning, you know, of their comrades. And I think just 2 places in which it looked is like in Austin, they had a chapter in Austin, and they worked with, sometimes they found other kinds of confrontational groups who were very clear in their self-determination politics. So they worked with the Brown Berets in Austin. Different folks in the Black Citizens Task Force also held that nationalist standpoint, while others in that same organization were more like community based and like voter registration. So there was like complexity on the local level. But then they also mobilized a mass response to shut down a Klan rally in Austin, I believe in '83. And so they got like students, punks, you know, masses of Austin community to come out. So they still held like a pretty strong political line around self-determination, and then brought more folks in around that. So that was one example of like one way that they did that. And the other is in Richmond, a Klan-like group was in the police department of Richmond Police Department, and they were outed. Definitely read that part. There's a lot of interesting pieces in there. What I think is relevant to your question, Ed, is like they were working with the NAACP and legal groups and liberal groups. And, you know, if you look at the arc of the organization, that's quite a different move from who they were working with originally. Yes. And they were part of a legal strategy, and they were part of like playing their very particular role of going to these affluent communities where the chief, you know, police chief lived, and applying pressure to where he lived, which was not actually the city of Richmond, which is, you know, historically low income and Black. So they played different roles at different times in different cities. And I think the complexity there is really rich to study. Yeah, James, what do you got?
Yeah, one of the favorite stories that were shared to us by our friends in the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, especially Howie Emmer and Nancy Kershan, was the Chicago story. Howie told me a story about when the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee chapter in Chicago was established later on, and they didn't have a Chicago chapter right from the beginning. I think it was about 85-ish that they started building one, that they were literally putting speakers on top of cars and going through white neighborhoods saying, "Free Seco Andiga, free all the political prisoners," and it didn't work. Because nobody responds to drive-by outreach. And when the when the far right in Chicago, which has always been there, right? Chicago is historically been one of the most racist northern cities amongst many, but had an extremely high concentration of skinheads, white Aryan resistance, traditional Klan, racist street gangs, all started to mobilize around and putting up racist graffiti and public demonstrations. They really learned the value of organizing, largely, I think, because Nancy Kershan was such a seasoned organizer to begin with, long before she stepped into a John Brown role. I mean, long history with many different formations on the left, and they built broad coalitions. So when it wasn't just a vanguardist thing of a few brave people going and tearing down the racist flyers, they got everybody together to do it. And if you look, and they went door to door asking people to sign on to an ad denouncing racism and the racist graffiti that was going to be, I think it was the Chicago Reader, and they lined up everybody from church folks to nonviolent practitioners, neighborhood groups, different revolutionary groups that didn't necessarily believe 100% in the John Brown worldview, but could be counted on to counter mobilize. And it was to me, it was largely successful, and that shift was really pivotal, especially at a time when I think as a gentle subtext in this was we had the far right and national and local governments were using graffiti as another form of racist code words and racist counterattacks, right? Another way to put people in prison, to criminalize people. And the fact was that the people doing the most offensive graffiti out there were white supremacists. And so just pushing back on that, I think, was a really smart cultural coalitional teaching moment. It was a shift, but it was something that was always there, right? We talk, it wasn't like a clean shift where there was no coalition building, because obviously working with folks like RNA came naturally, but learning how to work across the progressive spectrum was something that they got really good at, especially in Chicago, and also in Vallejo, California, when I first met them, really trying to put do a counterattack against the Aryan Woodstock concert that happened in 89. All right. Can I go shoot a question over?
Do it.
Yeah, please.
Right. So along the lines of coalition, over the past few years, those of us who are committed to changing the world for the better have spent a lot of time on Facebook and Twitter and essays and conferences debating the concepts of allies, accomplices, and comrades. Does this debate even matter anymore? Why or why not?
That's a good question. I'm sometimes tempted to say, oh, it's all semantics, but semantics do really matter in terms of how we frame ideas and start to think about and put into action these ideas. And so I'll resist the temptation. What I'll say though, that probably still gives into the temptation just a little bit, is I do think that these words matter. I do think that, for example, that solidarity is more powerful than allyship because of how I've seen it operationalized when people have chosen to use those words. And I do think that there's a certain edge that I feel and that I think people are intending to put out there when they use something like accomplice, because I mean, what we're talking about, people may have broken some laws. So, and some people are in prison and charged as criminals. And even though I don't think that I would call them criminals and I wouldn't call anyone who supported them accomplices, I can understand why, especially recently, I've been hearing that term a whole lot more for people who are engaged in left revolutionary politics, because we are treated like criminals, right? What I'm more interested in, though, just to get back to what I said earlier, is how do people operationalize their work with one another? I mean, really, let's just start. How do they operate? How do they put into action their own ideas first and foremost? And then how do they work with other people? Is it based on a temporary, very narrow tactic? Hey, we really need to just get rid of these police, these white supremacists in the police force in Richmond. So let's do this. Or we need to bring Robert F. Williams home. So let's team up with that group, and we can get a petition going. Or is it because there's something about the end goals that people have in common, and it therefore becomes a longer term coalition and things like that? A couple of examples I'll give of each one. I've mentioned N'COBRA, but before N'COBRA was even created, Chokwe Lumumba, Akinyele Umoja, Queen Mother Moore was there. I mean, all the people who we love to name came together and formed the New African Peoples Organization. And it was a long time in the making. People from RAM and African People's Party and people from House of Umoja, from the PGRNA, they wanted to create a revolutionary political party that could engage with the masses in ways that they didn't feel like the provisional government was. And because the provisional government was organized as just that, a provisional government, the governing body that's gonna, ideally lead people to the goals and help govern them and create the state that they're talking about. They ended up and continue to be, and they form coalitions, right? They work together on a number of things. They go to each other's meetings. I mean, it helps that some people are in both, right? Provisional government and NAPO. But then there's also solidarity, and New African independence activists have, again, from the beginning, recognized that before they make any claims to the land, there are the land claims of the indigenous nations who were displaced, who were violently exiled, and all types of, who they were there first, basically, right? And so there's been quite a bit of work, from what I understand, to always recognize and work in concert with various groups whenever the time was opportune. And even when they weren't working directly together, I've seen, and I cite a few documents in my book that very explicitly say, hey, look, indigenous nations have claims that nobody else has, and we need to respect their claims. And, we're talking about the 5 states, but we can negotiate it with them. We're not going to negotiate with the capitalist system, right, which is trying to get rid of that, but with other oppressed nations, we really want to work this out so that it works for everybody. And so, yeah, that's true solidarity in the way that I understand it. And it leads to opportunities for people to work, sometimes literally hand in hand for certain actions. And that's what I think is probably more important than the specific words that we use, even though I definitely think the specific words are important, and we have to be very clear about what we're saying when we use them, clearly define and again, operationalize these different ideas. Having said that, one of the things that I believe to be true, but I will never know because there's some things that I just don't have. There's some information I just don't have any access to. But I think that there's enough evidence out there to support that people like Assata Shakur, who was able to break out of prison, had to rely on networks of comrades who were, people like the Weather Underground, people who from May 19th, et cetera, in order for her escape to be successful. And, I mentioned that because she was in prison when she and her comrades were violently assaulted going from one place to another. And with that being the case, and that's just one example of violence that's perpetrated against revolutionaries and even non-revolutionary activists on a regular basis. And so, just to throw this back in your court, I see, looks like Hilary might have. Okay, but just to put this back in your court, James.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, you talk about self-defense quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And I do immediately think of people who defend themselves from physical violence. But the way that I read you talking about self-defense throughout the book, it seemed to be much more well-rounded than just, armed self-defense or, punch a Nazi if they do something wrong or whatever it is. So could you explain what self-defense meant and how people defended themselves from the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee?
Yeah, I think that it directly relates to coalition building, right? So on one level, self-defense is self-defense, right? Oppressed people have the right to shoot back if shot at, right? Oh, I have the right to punch if punched, and there's a political aspect to it. But on one level, it's very basic like that. And on the other level, there's lots of actual nonviolent self-defense stuff that was practiced in these alliances every single last day. There was the refusal to talk to grand juries, right? No matter what you personally thought of the person who was being investigated by the grand jury, their tactics, their politics, their alignments, you refused you refused to testify in front of the grand jury, and oftentimes had to do up to 18 months in prison. People like Pam Fadum, one of my heroes, almost all of them got at some point got some sort of subpoena, showing up, right? Just basically, if one group is under attack or maybe under attack, you show up physically, because as we've seen then and now, the more people that we mobilize, everything that actually the less potential of violence, as we saw with Charlottesville, then we saw Boston, right? Nothing bad happened in Boston 2 weeks after Charlottesville because 40,000 people got out there. So showing up is really important. Another way, and certainly, and then using these moments where immediate solidarity was and self-defense was necessary to build long-term visions, taking programmatic cues from each other. John Brown Anti-Klan Committee always had columns from the folks that you wrote about in their newspapers, right? And to me, that's also taking and humanizing and explaining the politics of your colleagues by letting them speak for themselves, so broader people are willing to eventually defend, to defend your colleagues and your comrades. In the end, is also laying the grounds for self-defense. You see it all over the place. I did say, and you touched a little bit on this. Quite nicely, but Malav and somebody else, brought up the issues around indigenous people in these states, and I think you're absolutely correct around in your assessment. My readings and research certainly back that up. But let's also remember that there were steps to get to that correctness, right? The first map that was put out about new boundaries of what what the continent of North America might look like after being reshuffled and remixed in this way, gave indigenous people some of the worst land, like literally like the coldest stuff up at the top of Canada, right? And those things changed in dialogue and building coalitions, and receiving criticism. So it certainly was a they both groups certainly deepened their understanding of indigenous politics, and certainly wasn't something that was perfect the first time that their explanations of it showed up in their newspapers. It was a work in progress, which I think is something to really remember for today. Is Hilary back with us yet?
Not just yet. We're trying to get her back.
All right. Well, we will.
Is there any chance to discuss fascism?
Yeah. Tom, do you have a do you have a question around that?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. I'm kind of discouraged that there's never been a mention of fascism so far, and the relationship of fascism and racism. They're actually two different things, but they're connected, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we talk about fascism? Because that's our biggest threat right now. And we need to confront that. The history is great, but we need to talk about now from my perspective.
That's actually my next question, Tom.
Thank you. Please talk
You're reading
about
my
now,
mind.
because we have to deal with this.
Yeah. Absolutely. I was going to ask, so here's how I've actually framed the question, right? And I think Tom is exactly right. We seem to be living in a moment in which the warnings of the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee regarding the rise of fascism and violent racist terrorism are really, they strike me personally as a chilling prophecy. And I've been saying up until May, we're towards fascism. Now I think we crossed that line into fascism, right? And so, yeah, James, definitely.
Fascism now.
Yeah. So what does fascism mean, first of all? And how do you see it operating at this current moment? Because it's not going to look exactly like Italy and Germany and things like that. And what are some of the lessons that the activists, community-oriented scholars, and everyday people can take from this history that you and Hilary have written about? And I have a follow-up question to that as well, to those two.
Great. Well, so fascism is many things. There's many layers to fascism. I like how Shane Burley talks about it as being a political commitment to violent inequality, right? And it, and to one of the things that John Brown Anti-Klan Committee really brought out about fascism, which I think you touched on, Tom, is that they used a term that was new at the time called the Nazification of the Klan, because up until that point, most white supremacists were trying to preserve white supremacy as a power structure within the U.S. constitutional system, right? They still saw themselves as Americans, for whatever that means, right? As citizens of the United States. And in the 80s, you see you see the revolutionary right really start to change the face of violent white supremacist organizations, to the point where, overthrow the United States government, institute a fascist regime that way. Groups like Stormfront, White Aryan Resistance, all of that. So that was a shift that is probably the most direct line to today, right? Because you see a lot in the far right's coalition right now. You even see splits between people that on the far right who would like to dump Trump, that are disappointed that he is not fascist enough, if that could even be imaginable, right? That he hasn't moved quickly as he did around expulsion of immigrants, and being a friend of mine who remain nameless, actually sent me some interesting screenshots where they were upset that even Trump was talking with Kanye West, right? Which is like, okay, so fascism, the fascist movement today, which has not completely hasn't completely taken over, but is getting there. We're not, or else we wouldn't even be having this conversation, or whatnot. But is certainly there. Certainly has its hands on, has given up on respectability, right? It's given up on respectability. It's given up on the United States, and whether things happen for them within the electoral process or through extra electoral doesn't even matter, right? It's like whatever works for us in the moment. They're very flexible with their tactics. And I think that something that ties into both of our books around fascism is how clever they are at narrative, right? At bringing of spinning a narrative that oftentimes sounds on its for the first paragraph like a left-wing critique of the state and of corporate corporate domination over our lives, of globalization, things like that. But they want to take that. This is why I wish Hilary was back on the call, because she's done fantastic scholarship around fascists trying to co-opt environmental concerns and global warming, and leading us towards an anti-immigrant, pro-expulsionist, paradigm. So yeah, fascism is, you're absolutely correct, Tom, about fascism. But one of the things that we really wanted to concentrate on this stop of the book tour was the alliances. In my world, I cut my teeth doing housing organizing, tutored by a former Black Panther, and the way that I always learn, I think there's more to this description, but I think it's accurate, is that, and my friend Dan Sabater also echoed this, who was an anti-racist left-wing skinhead activist, was that fascism is really it's the defense game for the state, right? We know that real white supremacy, probably more people have been killed by planning codes, right, and by redlining, and by healthcare disparities than anybody who's ever been killed by the Ku Klux Klan or related boneheads. But when there's times where these structures are called into question, like with the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements for freedom, and the prospect of more egalitarian solutions, whether they be public policy or total political shifts, are there, that's when fascism really gets the funding and really starts picking up to do its organizing.
Great.
Thank you for that.
And just to follow up, there are a lot of lessons that we can take from this history in terms of how the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee organized to combat white supremacy and I'll say fascist wannabes. They tried. How can we begin to immediately apply these lessons? I guess one way to ask is, what are some definite steps that I can take, my students can take, and people who I know who are organizing in the streets to protect ourselves against, again, this what I think is a chilling prophecy from the committee?
Hilary, you're back. Take that one.
Back, totally. Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I mean, most immediately is, in my opinion, one of the lessons in, the last chapter, we go through like what the lessons we think in this moment are from the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, including like their massive strengths, as well as some of the challenges that we saw of their work in that time. We encourage folks to read the book, make your own interpretations, do your own research as well. Like, let's get in it together. So these are just James and as well as like, you know, the milieu we are in, the lessons we thought were relevant for today. I mean, right off the bat, given the moment we're in, given what's happening in Portland, given what's happening in Louisville, given what will likely continue to happen, is more state repression. And there's a lot of really important tools out there right now in terms of how to keep each other safe, and especially the politics of non-cooperation. And so I guess the number one underlying point, which I feel like is both present in your book, Ed, is definitely present in our book, is like, don't talk to the FBI, non-cooperation. Like, even if you think that you are not particularly of interest, and I'm like gonna shout out like all my white anti-racist folks of like, even if the FBI is like really friendly to you, please do not talk to the FBI. Real talk, there was a situation recently in our network where this question came up. There was real concern of a real incident where, yeah, FBI contacted them, asked friendly, nice questions, and seemingly was innocuous. It was just like, you know, not a big deal. But within the context of the role that white folks play in moments of heightened repression, which is usually a backlash against the gains of Black and brown folks and gaining more political, economic power. Very often, white people, white radicals are seen as like a weak link, and that the state can push on and perhaps get more information about your friends, friends of friends, organizations you support, organizations that you are in, you know, coordination with. And there's many lessons to draw out, but I feel like given what's been happening in some of my context and my political work, I think number one point is don't talk to the FBI, and look into the long legacy of non-cooperation, the many movements that have participated and practiced this principle and this politic, all the P's. I did not mean for that to happen, but there's a rich history there about how to do it, how to raise awareness, how to make it as public as possible, how to make it a political opportunity. And I'll pass to James, or yeah. Ed,
well, I actually have a follow-up question for you. When you were cut off for a little bit, the question came up, what is fascism? And could you explain what fascism is based on your research?
I was muted by the host for a moment. Am I back on?
You're back.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, there's many ways. It's all contested. I'm sure you all covered that, right? Like blah, blah, blah. Academic this, interpretation that, exclusion, blah, blah. There's a ton out
like
there. Like this. I mean, if you want to get nitty gritty of like what it means today within a historical context, how to stop it, right? Shane's book is pretty awesome for that. How I interpret it, especially with my recent work around how the far racist right in Europe engages climate and how to delineate around that, I think is in particular around, you know, using or like counterinsurgency, more or less, right? Like it can be, yes, using the state apparatus, but it's for another means, and there's a transformation in how that apparatus is used. And then of course, it's really the ideology in terms of exclusion, expulsion, and usually there's an aspect of nationalism in there. And there's different kinds of flavors, different kinds of traditions. You know, what happens historically in Europe may or may not be important markers for what happens now or the different iteration of it in the States. But I think in terms of, yeah, kind of like using the state apparatus for another means, as well as then who is eliminated in that process, whether it's like an ultimate goal or the path to power. Yeah. Not a clear, easy, succinct definition. I'm sure that added to what you all kind of covered too.
It did. Also, bouncing off of Ed's question about what to do now. Absolute 100% dedication to defending anybody who is targeted by state repression for anti-racist and anti-fascist activities, whether or not you agree with them. The great pacifist Henry David Thoreau wrote a defense, an essay called "In Defense of Captain John Brown." Those guys didn't agree on a lot, but he defended John Brown. And we have to be able, as a movement, to defend everybody. And certainly debates around violence, nonviolence, tactics, all those things are worthy, but we don't have them on Facebook, and we don't we don't slam people that are being targeted by the state while they're being targeted by the state. We get them out, we celebrate, and then close the door, have whatever debate you want after that. But another thing that I think that we should really think about is that anti-fascism is a, in a really optimistic way, has a strong line through United States 20th and 21st century history. We think about, oh, we have fascists. Well, guess what? We've also had the United Front Against Fascism conference in 1969, sponsored by the Black Panther Party, that attempted to build a broad coalition. We had for the more liberal versions of anti-fascism, we've seen anti-fascist Superman comics in the 40s, and Batman comics, and Captain America. So there's a lot of people that, whether or not they articulate their politics as people who have, in the same way that people who have been around left formations for a long time and read lots of books about this history there, have a revulsion towards fascism. And those are things, those are openings, cultural openings that we can use. So, cultural, we're creating an anti-fascist politics that is irresistible to that young person who's hitting their head up against the wall right now about their future. We know that the right wing, the fascists, will use their frustration to reach them, create a vision of a future that is exciting and life affirming and everything. And we have to do that using the best using our traditions, like going back to Blue Magazine in the 90s, Rock Against Racism movements in the UK, the Anti-Nazi League also there, Rock Against Reagan here. And we need to, that's also part of building an anti-fascist politics, the things that we can do. I believe that street counter mobilizations are absolutely necessary, but we also have guitars, we also have DJs, we also have our poets, and these are the people that can help to bring folks in. And then our organizations need to make anti-fascism irresistible, a joy to be in, right? Instead of a task.
Great, thank you.
Can I just check in? There was a question earlier that James mentioned. I just wanted to make sure that you saw it too, Ed. That was from Kaylani. There was kind of the question. I can reread it for folks who didn't see it. So Kaylani asked a little earlier, specifically to you, Ed, in your research on new African Black nationalists mobilizing to establish a Black nation state, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, how did they understand those territories as the indigenous homelands to Native nations, most but not all of which were forcibly removed in the 19th century by the federal government to Indian Territory, which later became the state of Oklahoma? 5 of those Native nations, not all from that region, also held African slaves. So I wonder if that fact figured into their vision of reparations.
Their vision of reparations is more narrowly focused on African and African descended peoples than it is the totality of the oppressed nations, at least as far as what I know. One of the things that I say in the book, there's a lot of silences, right? Whenever we do this research, especially when we do research on revolutionary movements, there are just sometimes things are stolen and we have plenty of examples of that with the New African Independence Movement. They don't have their original documents. They've probably been destroyed by the FBI. Other times, information is too sensitive to be repeated, especially to somebody like me, right? And so in terms of what I have access to, I have not seen an articulation of reparations outside of the New African context. What I have seen is, James mentioned a redrawing of the map of the United States of America as a post-revolutionary conglomerate of independent nation states where these oppressed nations have political power, have ownership over the land. I put ownership in quotes because, you know, there are different understandings of what that even means. And I'm bringing that up because for New Africans, part of the reparations agreement is that land and that will become sovereign. And so based on that, I could say, well, yeah, they talk about it in terms of restoring land to the original inhabitants. And of course, where the claims that they make, they want to negotiate with folks because they're not trying to supersede any land claims of anybody else. But in terms of everything else that they talk about in the anti-depression program, in terms of the financial remuneration, I can never say that word. I haven't seen anything articulated outside of the New African context.
And Kehlani just mentioned, just to clarify, that she said, I don't mean reparations for natives. I mean, did the Black nationalists see claiming native lands as part of reparations owed to them from the native nations who were slaveholding nations? Just to clarify.
Yes. Yeah. And I hopefully just answered that, but yes, they did. They did and they do.
Cool. So yeah, if anyone has any other questions, now this is kind of the last chance probably to get maybe a couple more questions in. And is it okay if I throw out a question to you all too now?
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I was just thinking about, you know, both of these books came out earlier this year, right? And obviously when you were doing the research and getting ready to publish them, you felt that they were relevant for the current moment. But of course, since these two books have been published, a lot has happened in the world, right? I mean, your book tour was canceled because of this global pandemic. And then of course, in late May and most of the month of June and to the present, you know, we're still in summer 2020, we've had this uprising against systemic racism and police violence. And so I was just curious for you all just to speak to that, just if you believe that perhaps, are these books even more relevant now? And if so, how?
Would you two like to go first?
Go for it, Hilary.
I would actually like to say something and then pass it to Ed, because there's you know, feel free to take it wherever you want. But one thing in reading Free the Land that kept just striking me over and over and over again, which is something entirely galvanizing for this political moment, especially with the Breathe Act coming out and the movement for Black Lives and the global rebellion. Yes, we are in a pandemic and we're also in a global rebellion. And I'm in Berlin, Germany, and not a lot of international news has been exchanged within the pandemic, a lot of shutting down, including our borders here. But one thing consistently, again, right, like Black liberation, Black freedom struggles does that work of going across borders. And that's one of the pieces that really moved people also in Europe, and that is consistent. And one thing in reading over and over again, Ed, your book is just how visionary, you know, and controversial, nation building, all these kinds of things. Yeah. It gets tricky right quick. But one thing that just was like underlined through line was that there is a Black future declared. There is a, you know, a positive future where Black folks get to govern their own lives, gets to have economic power, gets to determine what a whole, just, dignified life looks like, and how galvanizing that is. And so I just wanted to put that out there, but also it strikes me in this political moment of, you know, the Breathe Act is legislation, which is not independence by any means in the same kinds of context, but I'm curious for you. I'm kind of like taking Matt's question and like doing a little bit of this and then sending it back. But yeah, wherever you want to go with that, Ed, what do you think?
Yeah, you said that the idea is controversial. There are some people, I actually quote a very controversial statement within the book. One of the people who I interviewed talked about how African people in the United States are captive to the world's richest slave owner, right? And what he meant was that there are certain, even for oppressed nations, there are certain privileges that the state will allow or even encourage, right? And the encouragement is so they can point to, hey, look at Michael Jordan. He's not doing. Look at Oprah Winfrey. They're not doing so bad. Why are you complaining, right? And so he really gets at that. But another aspect of it is that when something happens in the U.S. and Black people rise up, other people see Black people here more than we see them, right? So it's kind of an unfair. Unfair. That's the nature of hierarchies and imperialism, right? Information from the United States gets privileged, and I have to go out and search for what's happening in other countries. I have to search hard, and I have to ask people in these various places, because what I get from the major news outlets and even from some of the independent ones that do a pretty good job just doesn't have much detail, doesn't provide much analysis, especially not useful analysis, because typically still liberal media, even if it frames itself as leftist. But one of the things that I think also comes out of that relationship, if we agree with this person, because I know some people don't agree with that statement about the world's richest slave masters. There are certain opportunities for liberation that people, I think, have a little more space to still imagine. And what I mean is, when I first started writing the book, about 10 years ago, I would mention my research to everybody who would ask, and they would look at me sideways. Oh, why would anybody do that? Right? Because they have a certain amount of relative privilege. And to put it in a slightly more crass way, the way that people have actually said it to me is, well, I'd rather live here than Africa. And, I just shake my head, shake my head. But because there's been so much attention in the corporate media to, human rights struggles, to so-called democracy protests, and typically, right-wing elements of nations that the United States has had some sort of imperial relationship with, right? Because we sometimes see these folks rising up, and the spin from the media is, oh, they're fighting for this, they're fighting for that, and it's spun in positive terms. I actually think that has had a really weird impact on people who weren't thinking about social movements before, because since at least 2012, people have been seeing this in their own lifetime. Okay, please kill us. And then people hit the streets, they protest, there's Black Lives Matter, there's, whatever else the slogans are. And this time around, I think it's just way different, because people are starting to understand the systemic nature of racial capitalism. I'm glad somebody put that in the chat, of racial capitalism, of this system, of this economic system, and this way of perceiving governance that explicitly builds wealth on the racist exclusion of people who have been deemed the other, right? And because they're starting to see that, the response to my book when it came out was much different than what I heard even 5 years ago, much different. I mean, even leading up, this is even before Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and them. Even a year ago, because of how people, I think because of how people see social movements being framed in the media that they consume, and because they've been seeing on a regular basis, okay, unarmed Black person shot in the back, nothing happens, people hit the street, rebellion, they calm down, everything goes back to normal. I think between the Trump presidency and the global pandemic, especially, that just kind of blew the lid off for a lot of people. And so the reception to the book, just to get back to Matt's question, has actually been way more favorable than I thought it would be. I mean, just to be completely honest, I really thought that I would continue to get the response I was getting a few years ago. Oh yeah, we're going to do African independence movement. Why would anybody do that? We're in America, right? We're Americans, it's great. And that's actually been really encouraging because I'm a scholar and intellectual first and foremost, but as a scholar who is informed by what happens in the community and who works with organizations and tries to help out on the ground, it definitely means that people are starting to rethink even what they're demanding. So in Philadelphia, there's the Black Philadelphia Radical Collective. I probably still have it in the wrong order. And there are 13 demands that on the surface actually look like something that NPR would get behind, right? Oh, they want to shuffle some funds around. And it looks great to people like that because it doesn't look too threatening. But they're actually calling for deep structural change. It's just below the surface if people actually read the demands. It's just below the surface. And I really think that these things combined make people more receptive to this book, to my book, and in turn, they're getting ideas for how to retool some of the activism that has been going on for quite some time, with hopes that it will be more substantive and create longer term changes and hopefully structural change at a point that's not in the too distant future. And so, yeah, thanks for turning it back. I'm gonna turn it to James.
I don't have much to say. I think that pandemic didn't change anything as far as the relevance of anti-fascism. We see what's happening. I think the exact way that fascism and extreme racism are expressed, those things are always open to be remixed, right? As we just saw what happening in Portland with the appointment of the mysterious federal troops, literally snatching people off the streets. We're in some really perilous times. So, but unfortunately for us, the Republican New Africa and John Brown Anti-Klan Committee were very prophetic. They weren't only good at describing what was going on in the 70s and 80s, but they were prophetic about the consequences of not confronting these organizations and these cultural shifts as we've seen, as we've seen now. So yeah, in answer to your question, yeah, it's really relevant, unfortunately, and I hope for a day where we could all gather and say, hey, those were some great books of history, but they're no longer relevant to our lives because we've built a much better world.
That's the goal.
I think that's about all we really have time for. This is really an amazing program. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Hilary. Thank you, James and Edward. I mean, really for putting together this wonderful program. Also Matt at Wooden Shoe Books in Philly for serving as an awesome co-host. So I'd like to encourage everyone to please do purchase copies of No Fascist USA from Wooden Shoe Books. Help them out. It also helps out City Lights publishing arm. Indie books and indie publishing really do need your help at this time to survive. So it's a really good way of being supportive. We can't survive without your help. So use the links in the comments section to the right on your screen to access that portal. Also, I'd like to remind everyone there are 2 additional events in this series. One's going to be Sunday, August the 9th with Mark Bray. It's going to be sponsored by Powell's Bookstore in Portland. And also on Thursday, August the 27th with Susan Reverby. It's going to be sponsored by Carmichael's Bookstore in Louisville. All the registration can take place at citylights.com on our calendar, the website of our calendar. So I can't think of a better way to end the proceedings than to invite Bill Crossman to read a poem. Bill, let me kind of open this up for you. Can you hear us, Bill?
Yes, hi. I should just mention that I was in the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee in the Bay Area, and I was interviewed by James for his book. And just one thing I wanted to second in that things were mentioned, that part of self-defense and part of coalition building was organizing benefits, cultural work. And in the Bay Area, I was directly involved with organizing punk and jazz musicians for benefits that brought a lot of young people, young white people particularly, to parks and other places. We had Dead Kennedys, the Millions of Dead Cops, MDC, and stellar jazz performers at the renowned Keystone Corner Jazz Club in San Francisco, and so on. I'd like to read a short poem. This is from my recent book, War in America. And given the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and more, and the resulting protests, there's a poem in here called Southwest LA Spring 1992. And of course, it's after the beating of Rodney King and then the just explosion and insurgency that happened after that all over the country. But this is about what happened in LA after that. And these first two lines are quotations from city leaders, both Black and white and Latino, after the riot, or I'm sorry, during the riot, trying to like put a lid on it, on the protest and the insurgency. The first, and these were newspaper headlines: after a riot, healing must happen, unquote. Another one: the community raged, now it needs to heal. And I begin, we've heard these voices before, speaking as if Southwest LA were a body with third-degree burns, and Healy only meant the scabbing over of burnt flesh, a drop in surface temperature, the, quote, cooler heads, unquote, back in charge. We've heard these betrayals before. Only freedom can heal a slave revolt. When warring street youths knot their colors, shoot hoops together, address their common enemy with one rhythm, it's deeper than skin deep.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Good
much.
to hear you, Bill.
Thank you all.
All right.
All right, y'all. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Talk to you tomorrow, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.